And it's aimed at, in fact, actually, verse 9 tells us who it's aimed at. To some who are confident of their own righteousness, look down on everyone else. That's who Jesus tells the parable for. Those who are confident of their own self-righteousness. I want to tell the parable again, though, in a slightly different context. And I'm going to choose Cork City, which is where I'm from, and I'm going to get you to imagine two houses in Cork City, in two totally different areas. The first one is a red brick house, in a nice avenue of red brick houses. It has lovely wallflowers hanging down, or baskets of flowers. It's lovely little boxes of flowers on the windowsill. And it has this beautiful bow window, or bow window, whatever way I want to pronounce it. And inside lives a local preacher with the Methodist church and his family. And he likes to sit in that window every morning and read his Bible. And he's quite happy for people to see him as they pass by, because he thinks it'll be a good witness to him. But he prays, "Dear God, I'm so grateful for who I am and what I have. I'm so grateful that I get to walk at a great church and I don't have the problems that other people have. I'm so grateful that, like so many people, I've never had a drink, I've never smoked, I've been faithful to my wife and a decent father to my child. I always go to church and faithfully pay my tithes. I am just thankful that I'm not like so many people out there who live such terrible lives. I'm so grateful that I've never been like them and never will be. Thank you for your many blessings." So that's the prayer of the local preacher. Now, in the same city, on the other side of Cork, there's another house in a rather rough neighbourhood. Most of the houses just beside this house are shut up and dilapidated. Once you go into the house itself, it's dark because the electricity has been cut off. And there's a distinct smell of sweat and urine and possibly even vomit. And on the floor, there's a whole series of syringes, used syringes. And in the upstairs room, close to the window, there's a man sitting on a stool with his back against the wall, and there's a little coffee table in front of him, and he has a little row of cocaine gathered up like you see them doing on television. And he bends down to snort it, and then suddenly God breaks through, and he suddenly turns and says to heaven, "Oh God, there is no other person on this planet more worthless and less worthy to talk to you than I am. I have made terrible choices and I am suffering the consequences of them. I'm getting what I deserve. God, I'm asking you now, would you please have mercy on me?" Two homes, two people. Which prayer do you think God loved the most? And that's what the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector is all about. The problem with the Pharisee, when we read it, is we've already judged the Pharisee because we've seen Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees. But we have to be careful that by judging the Pharisee, we don't become guilty of exactly what he was guilty of, our pride. I remember many years ago, we used to take groups of young people from the Cork Church to Killarney for retreats. We used to do one every year. And I remember one of them, I was doing one of the lessons, and we were sharing with the group individually. We broke them up into pairs, and we were trying to affirm them by telling them something we thought they were very good at. And the person who was paired up with me complimented me on my humility. And I was rather pleased. And it was only several hours later I realised she was being sarcastic because I'm the least humble person. But I didn't have the self-awareness to realise what she was saying, because certainly humility wouldn't be the first thing you think of when you think of Brian Callan. And so I'm going to look at three prayers. The prayer of the Pharisee, the prayer of the tax collector, and then the prayer of the Christian. There's a film called Enemies on Netflix. And it's about a member of the Ku Klux Klan in the southern states of the US. and a black activist, and the relationship that develops between them by the end of the film. But at the beginning of the film, there's a picture of a Ku Klux Klan meeting. And this gentleman gets up to pray, and he prays with deep sincerity and deep reverence that was every bit as moving as any prayer you'll find in any church. And he reminded me of the Pharisee. He was deeply devoted to God, but he was just misguided in another aspect of his life. And we are conditioned to think of the Pharisee because of the constant interactions with Jesus. I worked with an Orthodox Jew for many years, an American, and he was an interesting guy because he was very much like a modern-day Pharisee. He never ate meat. He never touched wine. He always wore his little black kippah when he went to a meal. He never did anything manual on a Sabbath. No cooking, wouldn't light a fire, he wouldn't turn on a light switch on the Sabbath. It meant he had to he took the Sabbath very seriously, but it meant he had to take incredible precautions that he wasn't caught on a plane or at an airport on the Sabbath. And that was difficult if your meetings went from Monday to Friday and are finished on a Friday. So he was a very godly man. The interesting thing about it is, of the people at any meeting I went to, he was the one most like me. We both were the ones who always retired earliest. We were both the ones who ended up talking to each other and had some godly conversations. The Pharisees of Jesus' day would probably have been very welcome by the Wesleys when they started Methodism, because it was a holiness movement. And John and Charles were all about holiness. The Pharisees were expected, or our Jewish people were expected to fast once a week. But the Pharisees insisted on fasting twice a week because of the devotion to God. They also had not just the Ten Commandments, but 613 edicts that they aimed to follow or conform to. But not only that, they were also, of their time, leading social reformists. Josephus tells us, that he was a Roman historian, he tells us what happened in his Antiquities of the Jews about a time when Herod insisted that everybody stand before him and acknowledge his work or take a note. And the one group that refused were the Pharisees, and there were about 6,000 of them in Israel at that time. And Herod punished every one of them. So that's the background to the Pharisees, rather than just the Pharisees that we are conditioned to think about. Because when I look at a Pharisee, I see myself. I don't associate with the humble prayer of the tax collector. I associate with the prayer of the Pharisees, because they were basically the good guys rather than the bad guys. What was troublesome to Jesus was that in their zeal for God, they'd forgotten to give thanks to God, or forgotten to look for what God was actually saying. As verse 9 said, he aimed the parable at those who trusted in themselves and they were righteous and regarded others with self-contempt or with contempt. The Pharisees should have known better. So often we should know better when we judge others. We can't help ourselves but judge others. Especially when we look at the drug addict, or we look at somebody who's maybe not such an attractive person. Jesus said, "Judge not, lest you be judged." He wasn't giving us something that we put up in gold calligraphy on the wall. He was actually giving us a principle for life. The Pharisees were good at obeying the rules. They were good at following what was written. What they were lacking on possibly was compassion, kindness, some of the other things where we live out our relationship with God. They just didn't get that. But the most important thing is knowing what God was saying to them. They had great devotion, they had great zeal, but they didn't know what God was saying in the situation. And then there's the prayer of the tax collector. There was probably no one held in more contempt at this time than the tax collector. Even lepers probably weren't held in as much contempt. And the reason for this is that in Israel at this time, the Romans were in power, and the Romans stayed in power because of the taxes that the local people paid. And they didn't have a form for everybody to fill out. What they had was a tax franchise. So they appointed people to collect the taxes. And so individuals auctioned, if you like, themselves to see who would collect the most. And like if Mr. Brooks was going to be the taxman, he said, I'll take in 7,000 denarios a month. And if that was the highest bid, he became the tax collector. Now, if he collected 9,000, that was fine. The Romans didn't mind. They were just getting their 7,000. So the other 2,000 went into his pocket or into his bank account. And hence, the tax collectors were the more prosperous of society at the time. And so they weren't liked. They didn't need anybody to tell them how other people felt about them, because they saw it in every encounter that they had with individuals as they collected taxes. But this tax collector's prayer was simple and humble. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He had realized his lack of worth in God's eyes. He didn't make a big list of things he had done wrong. He didn't try and justify himself by saying, well, everybody's at it. He didn't try and bargain. He just was aware he was unworthy in God's eyes, and he simply sought mercy and forgiveness. And God appreciated the prayer. The tax collector didn't try and exalt himself, but he was exalted in the process. And he went home more justified than the other. And the prayer for the Christian, it's simple. We should be more like the tax collector than the Pharisee. Sometimes it's difficult not to be like the Pharisee. In 1991, there was a film called City Slickers. Billy Crystal played a guy called Mitch, who was a successful businessman, and himself and a group of others were going out to a ranch in California to spend 2 weeks on a retreat. And the guy who's leading the retreat is a guy called Curly, who was played by Jack Palance. And at one point, Curly says, you city folk worry about a lot of stuff, don't you? You all come up here about the same age, with the same problems. You spend 50 weeks a year getting knots in your rope, and then you think 2 weeks up here will untie them all. None of you get it. You know what the secret of life is? And Mitch says, no, what? And Curly says, this. And Mitch says, your finger? And Curly says, no, one thing, just one thing. You got to stick to that, and everything else don't mean nothing. And Mitch says, that's great, but what about that one thing? And Curly says, well, that's what you got to figure out. And for us, that one thing actually is our relationship with God. Our relationship with God. And within that relationship, it's all about us humbly sitting before God and not comparing ourselves to anybody else. It's why the sense of when Isaiah talks about our filthy righteousness, because no matter how we are, we can't help but think about we are better off than somebody else. But it's having an attitude of living in thanks for the blessing we have, in thanks for the blessings that God has given us, without in any sense judging somebody else because they haven't been so blessed. Last year, the writer Edna O'Brien died, and she was buried on Holy Island in Lough Derg. And RTE, just before the wedding, the funeral, we played an interview with her when she was interviewed by Gail Byrne on the meaning of life. And she was asked, when you meet God, what would you say? She replied, "At one time I would have said, 'Forgive me,' but not now. Now I would say, 'Bless me.'" She didn't feel there was any need of forgiveness. Like so many people in the world today, there's no sense that they feel they have offended God in any way. I heard Skibbereen saying exactly the same thing in an interview that he was interviewed. And in a sense, actually, the core of our relationship with God is knowing that we are unworthy. Appreciating that He's paid an incredible price for our sins. If you're not sick, you don't want a doctor. If you don't feel that you have sinned, then you won't feel the benefit of God's forgiveness. You won't feel the sense that you were the tax collector in God's eyes. Because God doesn't have a big chart where He's rating people one against the other. God has His forgiveness. And we should live our lives in a sense that we have been forgiven. And if that doesn't affect the way we treat others, the way we think about others, or the way we talk about others, it hasn't seeped through to our being. In conclusion, there was a young boy who wanted to measure himself. He wanted to find out how tall he was, but he didn't have a ruler. So he made one. And he measured himself and he called out, 9 feet, Mummy. I'm 9 feet tall. And that's how it is when you measure yourself against yourself or against your own ruler. There's a sense in which we got to measure ourselves against the ruler God has given us, or the sense of what God has given us. It's very easy to be the Pharisee. I am the Pharisee so often. And the passage is directed at the Pharisee. And it's all about becoming like the tax collector. So in summary, the prayer of the Pharisee was the prayer of the proud. Thank you, God, for making me as good as I am. It's all about how I am. The second, the prayer of the tax collector, the prayer of the humble. I'm sorry, God, that I'm as bad as I am. And the prayer of the Christian is copy the tax collector. Pray for mercy and pray that God will make us more merciful. And beg for wisdom to understand the voice of God. Let's just bow our heads.